connection is his wife is the sister of Gina Podolsak, Buchanan resident of many years, who many of you know, so that's the connection. And Bill's wife, Chris, is with Gina, and I said, why wouldn't they come as my guests? And Bill said, they've heard this talk before and they don't want to hear it again. So, Bill William Martin is the New York Times best-selling author of 12 novels, a PBS documentary, book reviews, magazine articles, and a cult classic horror movie as well. His first novel, Back Bay, is from Boston, established him as a master storyteller. He's been following the lives of the great and anonymous in American history ever since, in novels like Cape Cod, Citizen Washington, and The Lincoln Letter. His 2018 novel, Bound for Gold, which I've read, sweeps readers back to the California gold rush, and in the words of the Providence Journal, solidifies his claim as king of the historical thriller. He was the 2005 recipient of the prestigious New England Book Award, given to an author whose body of work stands as a significant contribution to the culture of the region. In 2015, the USS Constitution Museum gave him the Samuel Eliot Morrison Award for patriotic pride, artful scholarship, and an eclectic interest in the sea and things maritime. And in 2018, the Mystery Writers of America, the New England chapter thereof, gave him the Robert B. Parker Award. He served on many boards of the Boston Historical and Cultural Organization, lives near Boston with his wife, and has 3 grown children. And his latest book, which came out last year, which was described in the announcement, is called December 41. How lucky we are to have someone as eminent as
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. You're all business people, and believe it or not, writing is a business. And every business has a set of questions that any practitioner of any business must pose once they have a good idea and hope in some way to be able to advance their business. In my case, I got the idea for December 41 in the movies. We were watching the film about Churchill called Darkest Hour, with Gary Oldman as Winston Churchill. And Churchill, in the middle of the movie, the midpoint, it's structurally, when you're telling a story, the midpoint is one of the darkest moments in the story for the main character. He goes down into the basement of the War Department on a secure line and calls Franklin Roosevelt and asks Roosevelt, "Can you help us, Mr. President? It's May of 1940. France is falling. Our troops are trapped on the beach at Dunkirk. The Germans are closing in. What can you do to help us?" And FDR says, "I can't help you at all, Winston, because American politics ties my hands." And Churchill slumps in despair. The camera pulls back from him. And at that moment, he has to find within himself the resources to rise up again and lead England, and England alone, against the Nazi hordes for at least the next year and a half. And as I'm watching that, I'm thinking to myself, but in a year and a half, just 3 weeks after Pearl Harbor, Winston Churchill will stand next to Franklin Roosevelt on the south portico of the White House in Washington, D.C. on Christmas Eve to light the national Christmas tree and express the unity of the Anglo-American people in the fight against fascism. And what a target they will make. And there it was. A German assassin is going to try to kill Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill on Christmas Eve, 1941. Now, back to the part about the rules in any business. In my business, once I have a good idea, I have to ask myself the question and then answer it. Why here and why now? Well, we know that we're going to be traveling across America in this novel, So there are lots of here's, lots of locations, but why now? What day? What day will I begin this story on? What better day to begin it than on December 8th, 1941? One of the most significant days, perhaps, in all of world history. The novel begins like this, in Washington, D.C. It was the largest radio audience in history. On the cold coast of Maine, they were listening. Down on Wall Street, trading stopped so they could listen. On assembly lines in Detroit, they were taking long lunches so the auto workers could listen. In Chicago, the butchers stopped slaughtering in the stockyards to listen. In Kansas and Nebraska and Iowa, where they grew corn and wheat enough to feed the world now that the rains had returned and the dust had stopped blowing, the farmers were listening there too. In all the places where the muscle and sinew of America bound one state or town or family to another, they were listening to the warm baritone and patrician inflections that somehow never sounded too upper crusty coming out of the radio. Because Americans had awakened that morning to the cold reality of war. War in every time zone. War encircling the earth. War once more as the original human fact. In Hawaii, U.S. Navy battleships burned beneath great funerary clouds of black oil smoke. In the far Pacific, Japanese troops attacked along every line of latitude and longitude. In swirling blizzards of blood and snow, Russians and Germans slaughtered each other before Moscow. Across Europe, jackboots echoed and resistance guttered, while U-boats stalked freighters on the roiling gray Atlantic. But Americans were listening, because Franklin Roosevelt was about to make sense of it all. In Washington, the CBS radio announcer was describing the packed House chamber, the tense atmosphere, when suddenly his voice rose. And now, ladies and gentlemen, the president is appearing and moving toward the podium. And from out of deep bass consoles and tinny tabletop radios in every corner of the country, a roar exploded. Something between a cheer and an angry shout. The harsh, hard, ferocious cry of Americans lifting themselves from shock and drawing strength from the president who'd lifted himself from a wheelchair and by remarkable force of will was appearing upright before them. When the roar receded, the speaker announced, "Senators and representatives, I have the distinguished honor of presenting the President of the United States." More cheers and shouts, then Franklin Roosevelt's voice rang out, firm, confident, and indignant. "Mr. Vice President, Mr. Speaker, members of the Senate and House of Representatives, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan." And at that point, his voice travels out across America, because it isn't so much what's being said on December 8th in Washington, D.C. that will matter to me as a storyteller, but in numerous other places. The voice will travel all the way to Los Angeles, up and over the mountain ranges, and down into the warm green dream of Southern California, where it's heard on a radio in a place that is very, very creepy and very, very real, and if you know where to look for it, you could all visit it today. It's a place way out Sunset Boulevard, right opposite, the street is right opposite the entrance to the Riviera Country Club. By the way, I have a 3 o'clock tea time at Weeburn today, so I'm thinking golf right now. This is a place called the Murphy Ranch, except there was no Murphy and it wasn't a ranch. In 1933, fascist sympathizers in Southern California had purchased from the Will Rogers estate, because Will Rogers State Park was right next to it, 55 acres of canyon in the Los Angeles area, and surrounded it with a fence. And then they had built a road, they had built a power plant, they had built fuel tanks, water tanks, they had terraced areas for gardening, and they had engaged an architect who had designed a 40-room mansion, the plans for which you can still find in UCLA archives, a 40-room mansion that was to have been Hitler's Western White House. I read about this years ago in an article in Smithsonian Magazine, and I said, I need to open a novel right there. And on December 8th, 1941, the FBI fanned out across Los Angeles. First, they arrested the Japanese nationals that they had been watching, and then they turned on the Germans. And there were lots of Germans down in that canyon, practicing, drilling. They gathered there almost every day to play at soldier and prepare for Der Tag, when the fascists would rise up in America and start shooting the wrong people and start putting the right people in charge. Very scary stuff. And it all happened, and it was all true. And in the novel, the FBI arrests just about everybody down in that canyon on that day, except for one guy who gets away. And he's the guy they should have caught, because he's the guy who is, as German agent, charged with the task of getting himself to Washington, D.C. to pull the trigger on Franklin Roosevelt. That's how the story begins. Los Angeles, at the time, was a hotbed of pro-fascist and pro-German activity. Some of you may sit down to watch a basketball game tonight with the Lakers and the Denver Nuggets. When they're playing at home, the Lakers are playing in an auditorium that covers the area that used to be Figueroa and 14th Street in Los Angeles, which was the home of the German-American Bund. There are photographs of this place. You can walk into the German-American Bund in 1940 or 41, probably a place about as large as this with a larger ballroom. And to your left is the Aryan bookstore, which contains books, German cookbooks, German literature, and all the anti-Semitic material you could hope to find. To the right is the Gaststube, the restaurant, covered in red checkered tablecloths, serving great German beer and great German food, and on the walls all around are maps with push pins showing the movement of the German armies across Europe. And directly in front of you was the auditorium where they had their big parties, and every April, right around this time, would celebrate the Fuhrer's birthday with photographs of Hitler and large swastikas, and everyone marching around in brown shirts or sometimes in white shirts with Sam Brown belts. So the German influence was very strong in Los Angeles at the time. And these guys hatched all kinds of plans to try to upset the people of LA. One of these plans, which never came to fruition, was that they would kidnap Sam Goldman, Louis B. Mayer, Jack L. Warner, Harry Cohn, all the Jewish movie executives, all on the same day, and take them up to a park up above LA in a place called La Cañada and hang them all. They were, when we look at them now, we think they were kind of crazy. They were kind of silly in their traditions that they were espousing, and yet they were very dangerous. So that's the social strata of December 8th in Los Angeles that my villain comes out of. But December 8th is a significant day for another reason in American history and American popular culture. On December 8th, 1941, while FDR is giving his famous speech in Washington, the mail is arriving at Warner Brothers Studios in Burbank. And contained in one of the mail bags will be the books and plays that have been sent out from New York over the weekend by the people in New York who think all of these books and plays need to be read and reported on. And so one of them, which is assigned to a young man who turns out to be one of my main characters in this book, one of the young men who will, by a various lineup of circumstances and complications, end up trying to stop this German assassin. He is assigned that morning, as happened in history to another young man, he is assigned the play Everybody Comes to Rick's, which he has to do coverage on. Coverage is when And it's still the same way in Hollywood today. When a young person wants to get started in a studio, they start off in the story department, writing reviews of all the material that passes through the portals, even material submitted by big agents. And within 3 days, he would read that play and report on it and say, colorful atmosphere, tense mood, will make a great melodrama, a good vehicle for Bogey perhaps, or Ronald Reagan, or George Raft, one of those people. And I find it hugely appropriate that perhaps the greatest movie of World War II, a war movie in which only 1 or 2 shots are fired in the whole movie, it took life on the day that Franklin Roosevelt declared that we were at war with Japan. And it's one of the things that I try to do in this book and that I try to do in all of my books, whether we're talking about 1941 or the Civil War in a novel like The Lincoln Letter, or The Mayflower in a novel like Cape Cod, is to give you a sense of living in that time, not only through the characters and the way they talk, but in the whole expression of the culture that they live in. And in 1940 and 1941, the American popular culture was dominant in the world, and those movies were very important, and so was the music. You'll hear a lot of the music of the 1940s in this book, such as, well, what do you think the #1 song on December 7th, 1941 was? It had just come out on the Billboard charts, Chattanooga Choo Choo. And that sort of thing I work into the novel as I lift the novel into action and get you rolling with this suspense thriller that's going to begin in LA as a film noir, and then you're going to be on the Super Chief traveling across America, the Grand Hotel on Wheels, with these characters, and then you'll end in Washington, D.C., where our hero will be chased in the shadows, just as a Hitchcockian hero is chased in the shadows from one great American memorial to another in the process of trying to stop this assassin from doing his deed. But the third reason that I chose December 8th was that Churchill, on December 7th, Churchill had this moment. The butler comes into him at dinner. He's at Chequers, the retreat for the Prime Minister. He's at Chequers, leans over to Churchill, whispers something in his ear. Churchill jumps upstairs and runs up to the telephone. He calls FDR and says, "Mr. President, what's all this I hear about Pearl Harbor?" To which FDR responds, "It's quite true, Winston. We're all in the same boat now." And as Churchill would later write, "I went to bed that night contemplating the vast economic and military might of the United States, and I slept the sleep of the saved and thankful." Wow. England would survive. Next day, he ordered that his cabinet be convened to declare war on Japan so that the British could get right into the fight with the Americans. The Japanese, of course, made that all moot by already having attacked British interests in the Far East. And later that day, he began the process of setting up his trip to the United States. He really wanted to be in the United States to get into FDR's face, particularly after he heard or read the text of the Pearl Harbor speech in Washington, which makes no mention of the Germans. It's entirely about defeating the Japanese. And he says to Churchill, "I need to get there. We need to talk at the highest levels about this war." And FDR holds him off because FDR knows exactly why Churchill wants to be there. Churchill wants to persuade him immediately to turn on Germany. And of course, FDR doesn't like to be persuaded until the correct moment. And he knows exactly what he's doing. He's bringing the American people along to a moment when they will accept war with Germany. In fact, the next night, on December 9th, he has one of his fireside chats. We all think that FDR and Churchill, or FDR, had a fireside chat every week. But in 12 plus years of his presidency, he only delivered 51 fireside chats. And on that one on December 9th, which talked mostly about war with Japan, he ended his presentation by saying, of course, it would ill behoove us to defeat the Empire of Japan, only to turn and find that Germany and Italy were in control of the rest of the world. He was getting the American people ready. Well, the next day, Churchill, I was going to say emailed him, Churchill telegrammed him again. And FDR, at this point, relented. Okay, you can come ahead. We're really worried about your safety, but we want you in Washington, and we will be proud to have a conversation with you. Of course, on the next day, December 11th, Adolf Hitler makes it all moot anyway, because Hitler goes in front of the Reichstag, gathered at the Berlin Opera House, and after a 3-hour screed against FDR and Churchill, FDR, he called that man who makes his speeches by the warm fireside while Germans die in blizzards in Germany, or in Russia, Hitler declared war on the United States, which shocked the world, and that included his general staff, who had not planned for a war with the Colossus on the other side of the Atlantic. Anyway, on Saturday of that week, Saturday, December 13th, Churchill boarded the British battleship HMS Duke of York for a 10-day crossing on the stormy Atlantic, protected by destroyers, worried about U-boats, and pounding against the westerlies that are so powerful in the mid-Atlantic in the month of December. He called it, as he wrote to his wife in a letter, the worst 10 days of the war that I have experienced. One of his aides fell and broke an arm during one of the pitchings of the ship. Another one fell and hit his head and got a concussion. Churchill dosed himself throughout the journey with Mother Sill's seasick remedy, and with other things as well. We can't even get into his relationship with Eleanor Roosevelt and his drinking. That's a whole other story. But anyway, after 10 days, the battleship arrives at the Virginia Capes, the mouth of the Chesapeake. And he says, I cannot wait another day. Because the plan was that the HMS Duke of York would go all the way up the Chesapeake to the point at which a smaller vessel would take Churchill off and bring him to Washington, bring him up the Potomac. He said, I want an airplane right now. And so they put the battleship in at Norfolk. He boarded a small airplane. Churchill, his bodyguard, Tommy Thompson, he only traveled, even then, with one bodyguard. And behind him, Lord Moran, his doctor, and Lord Beaverbrook, his main advisor. The plane takes off up the Chesapeake. It's about 5 p.m. It's getting dark. They're looking out the windows on both sides. And they look out, and Churchill can hear this muttering from the other men. He says, what do you see? And they all agree. As Tommy Thompson says, I see lights. But I see more than lights. I see hope. I see freedom. America would observe a blackout, but it hadn't quite been properly put into operation in the first weeks of December. And so for these men who had been in blackout for about 2 years under the German Blitz, it was an inspiration to see those lights. If Churchill lands, FDR is there to greet him in a limousine in the Anacostia Naval Air Station. They drive to the White House, where on the front lawn of the White House, a photograph is taken that will shock the world. The photograph has FDR in the middle, standing next to Captain Beardall, his naval aide, holding himself up with a cane as well, and next to him, Winston Churchill. The next day, that photograph appears in newspapers all over the world. It's December 22nd, and the world is shocked because, well, the Germans thought that Churchill had gone to Egypt to visit his North African forces. The British didn't know where he was, and there he was on the White House lawn on the night of December 22nd. And in my novel, the German agent, and he does get to Washington, because you don't ever publish a novel like this with a target on the front and the White House in the target, and not have the assassin at least get to Washington and look through that gun sight. My German agent opens the newspaper and he sees that photograph and he says, "My God, I can get them both. I can end the war with 2 shots. I can do it." And how he is stopped is something that you all will have to read the novel about. That's why I write them. But before you read the book, go to my website, because on my website I have put together a historical timeline showing you all of the events of December 1941 via YouTube videos and movie trailers, and even the Glenn Miller Orchestra playing Chattanooga Choo Choo, if you care to see that, and culminating in what is one of the most amazing pieces of historical footage you will ever see of any world leaders from the past. Because on the night of December 24th, as the crowd is coming in, 22,000 people were allowed onto the White House lawn. This is just 2 weeks after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. They all had to pass through crude metal detectors to get there, which becomes a plot point in the book. But while all that's going on, the Pathé News Service, the British newsreel service, sets up a camera right here, pushes a button and lets it run. And what you see first is Franklin Roosevelt at the podium. There's a light. Churchill is standing here. They chat a bit. They have a little talk. Roosevelt looks around, never aware of the camera. And then you hear boom in the distance, the sound of the evening gun being fired from a fort across the Potomac. And FDR says, "And now for the 9th time, I light the living community Christmas tree of the United States." And he pushes a button, and you hear bells ring, and you hear the crowd applaud, and then he gives a great speech. And then he turns to his old and good friend Winston Churchill and asks him to give a few words as well. These words are being carried out across all of the English-speaking world at this point. And Churchill, of course, gives a galvanizing speech, a remarkable piece of rhetoric, in which he climaxes, "So let the little children," it's Christmas Eve, remember, "let the little children have their night of fun and laughter. Let the gifts of Father Christmas delight their play. Let us grown-ups join to the full in their unstinting pleasure, before we return to the stern task and formidable year that lies ahead. Resolved that by our efforts, those same children shall not be robbed of their inheritance or denied their right to live in a free and peaceful world. And so, in God's good grace, I bid you all a happy Christmas and all a good night." The world is electrified. Just remember, as he's saying that, there's a Nazi bastard out there with a big rifle trying to shoot him, and if not for my characters, he might pull it off. So I hope you have a chance to read the book, and I hope you enjoy it. I brought a few books in case anybody wants to purchase them. Thank you all for listening.